March 15, 44 BCE. The Senate house of Pompey stood heavy with tension. The marble floor gleamed, the walls echoed with footsteps, and shadows danced across the colonnades as Rome's most powerful men gathered. They carried daggers hidden in their togas, their faces pale with fear yet hardened with resolve. And then it happened. The dictator of Rome, Julius Caesar, entered the chamber, greeted by smiles that masked betrayal. Senators closed in around him. A hand tugged at his toga. A blade flashed and the first wound was struck. "Casca, what are you doing?" Caesar cried, shock flashing across his face. But the cry was drowned out as dagger after dagger plunged into his body. The great conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had defeated Pompey and declared himself master of the Roman world, fell under the weight of 23 wounds. His blood soaked the Senate floor. At the base of Pompey's statue, he collapsed. A cruel irony, dying at the feet of the man he had once defeated. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and their followers, stood trembling, their daggers red, their mission complete. They believed they had saved the Republic, that Rome would thank them for removing a tyrant. They were wrong. News of Caesar's death tore through the city like wildfire. Panic gripped the streets. Some wept for their fallen leader, others cheered the end of dictatorship, but most trembled in fear. They knew what Rome had become, a city ruled not by laws, but by legions and ambition. The death of Caesar did not restore the Republic. It created a vacuum, and vacuums in Rome were always filled with blood. But what the conspirators had not considered was this. Caesar had left behind a secret weapon, his heir. Far from the chaos of Rome, in the quiet countryside of Apollonia in Illyria, a young man received word of Caesar's death. He was barely 18 years old, thin, often sickly, with no military experience and little political reputation. His name was Gaius Octavius. Few in Rome had ever spoken his name aloud. He was Caesar's great-nephew through his mother Atia, but hardly seemed destined for greatness. He was known more for his intelligence and caution than for charisma or strength. To Rome's hardened generals, he was nothing more than a boy. But Caesar had seen something others had missed. He had adopted Octavius in his will, naming him not only his heir but his son. And with that adoption came Caesar's name, his wealth, his prestige, and his enemies. When Octavius read the will, he understood the weight of it. He was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the son of the murdered dictator. Rome might laugh at him, but the name of Caesar still carried thunder, and Octavius was determined to claim it. Octavius had a choice: remain in safety or march into the storm. Most 18-year-olds would have fled, content to survive in obscurity. But Octavius was no ordinary youth. He abandoned his studies and set sail for Italy. The journey was perilous. The Mediterranean was still restless from civil wars. Pirates haunted the waters, soldiers switched loyalties by the hour, and Rome itself was a city divided. But Octavius pressed on, knowing that the longer he waited, the weaker his claim would become. When he landed in Italy, he learned just how dangerous his inheritance truly was. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, his loyal general, his co-consul, had seized control of Caesar's papers, his treasury, and his soldiers. Antony saw himself as the natural heir, not some frail teenager. The Senate, too, dismissed Octavius as irrelevant. Cicero, the great orator, called him a mere boy who should be praised, honored, and then disposed of. To the ruling elite, Octavius was nothing more than a pawn. But Octavius was watching, listening, and planning. Octavius began to recruit. At first, only a handful of Caesar's veterans joined him, men curious about the boy who carried their general's name. But Octavius proved shrewd. He promised them rewards, honors, and vengeance for Caesar's death. He reminded them of their loyalty not to Antony, not to the Senate, but to Caesar, and by extension to him. Within weeks, his force grew. Veterans who had fought under Caesar marched under his banner. Slowly, his power swelled. What shocked Rome most was his boldness. Despite his youth and inexperience, Octavius confronted Antony directly. He accused him of misusing Caesar's legacy, of plotting to make himself king. He appealed to the Senate, presenting himself as the protector of the Republic and the avenger of Caesar. It was brilliant theater. Rome, weary of Antony's arrogance, began to see Octavius not as a boy but as a potential savior. Cicero, once dismissive, now whispered that Octavius could be the tool to rid Rome of Antony's tyranny. The boy was no longer a boy. He was a player. By 43 BCE, less than a year after Caesar's assassination, Octavius had transformed himself. He was no longer an unknown youth. He was a rising force backed by soldiers, money, and the magic of Caesar's name. In the chaos of Roman politics, he maneuvered with astonishing precision. When the Senate offered him command against Antony, he accepted. When alliances shifted, he adapted. When generals doubted him, he outsmarted them. Every step was careful, calculated. He knew he could not yet defeat Antony outright. Antony was still too strong, too experienced. But Octavius understood patience. The game of Rome was not won in a single move. It was won through cunning, betrayal, and timing. And time was on his side. The Ides of March had been meant to save the Republic. Instead, it unleashed its destruction. The daggers of Brutus and Cassius did not end tyranny. They paved the way for a new kind of power, more absolute than any before. And standing at the edge of it all was Octavius, thin, pale, untested, but burning with ambition. He had inherited more than Caesar's name. He had inherited his destiny. And though no one yet knew it, the Republic had only months to live. The funeral of Julius Caesar was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. His body, pierced by 23 wounds, was carried into the Forum. The conspirators hoped to bury him quietly, with dignity but without spectacle. Instead, it became a firestorm. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, took the stage. He read aloud Caesar's will, announcing gifts of money for the Roman people and the donation of gardens for public use. Then, with deliberate pause, Antony unveiled the blood-stained toga that Caesar had worn on the Ides of March. The crowd gasped. They surged forward, weeping, howling, demanding vengeance. Caesar's corpse was placed on a makeshift pyre. Flames leapt into the sky. The people rioted, tearing down buildings, chasing the conspirators through the streets. Rome was not celebrating its freedom. It was mourning its father. And amidst this storm, one name lingered in every ear, the heir named in Caesar's will, Octavius. When Octavius landed in Italy after Caesar's assassination, he was greeted with skepticism. To Antony, he was a child playing at politics. To Cicero and the Senate, he was a pawn to be used and discarded. But Octavius carried something more powerful than soldiers or speeches. He carried the name of Caesar. He immediately adopted it. He was no longer Octavius, the provincial youth. He was Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's son in name and in law. For the veterans of Caesar's legions, that name was sacred. He began reaching out to them, one by one. Many were retired, living in colonies scattered across Italy. Octavian promised them what they longed for: land, wealth, and above all, vengeance for the murder of their beloved general. Veterans rallied to his side, willing to take up arms once more for the son of Caesar. Within months, Octavian had assembled thousands of men. They were not yet the disciplined force of Rome's legions, but they carried the weight of legitimacy. Antony scoffed at the boy's army, but Octavian was not seeking battle. He was seeking leverage. Antony, meanwhile, wielded power like a hammer. He controlled Caesar's papers and treasury, giving him influence over appointments and resources. He strutted through the streets as though Caesar's mantle had fallen directly upon him. But Antony's arrogance made him enemies. The Senate, led by Cicero, grew restless. They despised Antony's swagger, his disregard for tradition, his hunger for power. Cicero, ever the orator, launched into a series of blistering speeches known as the Philippics, denouncing Antony as a drunkard, a thug, and a threat to the Republic. Octavian listened carefully. He had no illusions of being the Senate's ally, but he saw an opportunity. If Cicero and the Senate viewed him as a useful tool against Antony, he could gain legitimacy. He began to court them. He presented himself as respectful, obedient, a young man guided by the wisdom of Rome's elder statesmen. To Cicero, he played the role of student, to the Senate, the loyal defender of tradition. Behind the mask, however, Octavian was calculating every move. He knew that once Antony was weakened, Cicero and the Senate would turn on him too. But for now, Antony was the greater enemy. Octavian understood something most men of his age did not. Politics was theater. Power was not only taken on the battlefield, but won in the minds of the people. He carefully crafted his image. He portrayed himself as the pious son, honoring Caesar's memory with statues, ceremonies, and games. He paid out Caesar's promised gifts to the people from his own purse, earning their gratitude. Where Antony seemed arrogant, Octavian seemed humble. Where Antony seemed self-serving, Octavian seemed devoted. It was a masterstroke. By attaching himself to Caesar's memory, Octavian gained something Antony could never possess, the aura of destiny. The people whispered, "Perhaps this boy truly is Caesar's heir, chosen by fate to continue his father's work." In 43 BCE, tension erupted into open conflict. Antony, refusing to yield to the Senate, marched north to besiege the city of Mutina. The Senate, desperate, declared him an enemy of the state and appointed Octavian to aid their consuls in the fight. It was a stunning reversal. Just months earlier, Octavian had been dismissed as a child. Now, he commanded legions under the authority of the Senate. The battles that followed were fierce. Octavian's forces clashed with Antony's in bloody confrontations. Though the Senate's consuls were killed, Antony was forced to retreat. Octavian had proven himself not just a politician, but a commander. Yet victory was not sweet. The Senate, instead of honoring him, sought to limit his power. They still saw him as a pawn, useful only until Antony was destroyed. Octavian realized the truth. The Senate would never accept him as Caesar's heir. They wanted the Republic restored, a return to the old days. But Octavian knew the old Republic was dead. If he wanted to rule, he could not be the Senate's servant. He would have to become their master. Octavian acted with breathtaking audacity. In the summer of 43 BCE, he marched his legions on Rome itself. The Senate, caught off guard, was powerless. Octavian demanded recognition as consul, though he was only 19 years old. No one had ever seen such boldness from one so young. But with legions at his back, the Senate had no choice. Octavian entered Rome not as a boy but as a consul of the Republic, the youngest in its history. From that moment on, his position was secure. He had forced Rome to take him seriously. He had bent the Senate to his will, and he had shown that he was no one's pawn. By the end of 43 BCE, Octavian had achieved what seemed impossible. In less than 2 years, he had transformed from an obscure youth into one of the most powerful men in Rome. He had outmaneuvered Antony by winning the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. He had outsmarted the Senate by using their own authority against them. He had outshone every rival by presenting himself as the pious son of Caesar, chosen by fate to continue his father's work. But this was only the beginning. The real test still lay ahead. Antony was not defeated. Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins, still commanded armies in the east. Rome itself was weary, fractured, and dangerous. Octavian had claimed his inheritance. Now he would have to defend it, with blood, steel, and deception. And so the boy who had been dismissed as weak, unremarkable, and irrelevant now stood on the threshold of destiny. The Republic trembled, the legions stirred, and history leaned forward to watch. The heir of Caesar had arrived. The streets of Rome reeked of smoke and fear. The Senate had been humbled by a 19-year-old boy who now sat as consul, his legions stationed just beyond the city walls. Yet even as Octavian basked in his newfound power, two shadows loomed over him. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's fiery general, and Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the assassins who still commanded powerful armies in the east. The Republic was crumbling, and Octavian knew he could not face them all alone. To secure his future, He would have to make a pact with his enemies. In late 43 BCE, the three most powerful men in Rome met on a small island in the river near Bologna: Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, a lesser but influential figure who still commanded legions. The meeting was tense, heated, even dangerous. Antony and Octavian had been at each other's throats for months, each claiming Caesar's mantle. But both understood the reality. Neither could defeat Brutus and Cassius without the other. So they struck a deal. They would form a legal commission, an alliance backed by law, with extraordinary powers that would make them masters of Rome. It was called the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the informal partnership between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus decades earlier, this triumvirate was given absolute authority by the Senate to stabilize the Republic. In truth, it was nothing less than dictatorship by three men. The terms were clear. Antony would control Gaul, Lepidus Spain, and Octavian would govern Africa and Sicily. Together they would march east to crush Brutus and Cassius. But first, they had to secure Rome itself. And for that, blood had to flow. The triumvirs announced what Rome dreaded most: proscriptions, lists of enemies, senators, knights, wealthy citizens, anyone who opposed them, were posted in the forum. Their property would be seized, their lives forfeit. Rome descended into terror. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, sons turned in fathers, slaves informed on masters. Armed gangs roamed the streets, dragging victims from their homes. Heads of the slain were displayed on the rostra, their bodies thrown into the Tiber. No one was safe. The triumvirs had their reasons. They needed money to pay their armies, and seizing the estates of the wealthy filled their coffers. They needed to eliminate rivals who might rally opposition. And above all, they needed fear, a lesson to Rome that resistance was death. It was ruthless politics, Roman style. Among the names on the lists was one that shocked the world: Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero, the greatest orator of Rome, had once seen Octavian as a tool to destroy Antony. He had lavished praise on the boy, calling him a godsend. But Octavian had not forgotten Cicero's earlier contempt, and Antony, enraged by Cicero's Philippics, demanded his head above all others. Octavian could have saved him. He could have insisted Cicero be spared. Instead, he remained silent. Cicero fled his villa, hoping to reach the coast, but Antony's soldiers caught him. When the old man bared his neck, they struck. His head and hands, the very hands that had written his speeches, were nailed to the rostra in the forum. The message was unmistakable. The Republic's voice was silenced. Octavian had proven himself capable of the same cold pragmatism as Caesar. Sentiment had no place in power. For 2 years, the Second Triumvirate ruled with iron fists. Land was confiscated to reward veterans, displacing thousands of families. Cities were emptied as citizens fled violence or conscription. The nobility of Rome, once untouchable, lived in constant dread. But for the common soldier, loyalty was rewarded. Octavian and Antony distributed lands and riches, ensuring the legions remained loyal. The Republic had ceased to exist in all but name. Rome was now ruled by generals, and the law was whatever the triumvirs decreed. It was brutal, it was merciless, and it was effective. Yet even as they terrorized Rome, the triumvirs' eyes were fixed on the east. Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins, had not been idle. They had seized control of provinces, raised legions, and amassed wealth from the rich lands of Asia. By 42 BCE, they commanded more troops than the triumvirs. The war for Rome's future would be decided not in the forum, but on the battlefield. Octavian and Antony began preparing their armies. Lepidus, though officially a member of the triumvirate, was increasingly sidelined. The real struggle would be between Antony, the seasoned commander, and Octavian, the untested youth who claimed Caesar's name. For Octavian, it was the moment of truth. If he failed, he would be remembered as nothing more than a pretender. If he succeeded, he would become the avenger of Caesar. The stage was set for one of the greatest clashes of the ancient world. Meanwhile, In the east, Brutus and Cassius prepared for war. They believed themselves the saviors of the Republic, defenders of liberty against tyranny. Yet even among their ranks, doubts grew. The murder of Caesar had not restored freedom. It had unleashed chaos. Still, they hoped that with victory, the Republic might be reborn. They raised massive armies, recruiting veterans and mercenaries, and fortified their positions in Greece. For them, the coming battle was not merely for power, it was for the soul of Rome. In 42 BCE, the Triumvirs crossed into Macedonia with nearly 40 legions. Octavian, still plagued by illness and inexperience, often lagged behind. Antony, in contrast, exuded confidence, inspiring the soldiers with his charisma and bravado. Their destination: Philippi, a small city in northern Greece. There, on the wide plains, the fate of the Republic and Empire would be decided. As the armies drew closer, tension gripped both camps. For the Triumvirs, victory meant absolute power. For Brutus and Cassius, defeat meant death. Rome held its breath. Octavian, though less experienced, was no fool. He studied Antony's methods, learning the art of commanding men, the theater of speeches, the delicate balance of rewards and punishments. Yet even in these early days, differences between the two heirs of Caesar were clear. Antony fought with passion, trusting his charisma to bind the legions. Octavian fought with calculation, relying on discipline, propaganda, and the promise of Caesar's name. It was a contrast that would define their rivalry for years to come. As Octavian's legions pitched their tents on the plains of Philippi, he knew the moment had come. The boy who had once been dismissed as frail and irrelevant now stood at the head of armies, shoulder to shoulder with Rome's greatest commanders. Ahead of him waited Brutus and Cassius, the men who had slain his father in name. Behind him stretched legions ready to kill and die for Caesar's memory. The air was thick with destiny. Rome was no longer a republic. It was a battlefield, and on that battlefield, the future would be forged in blood. The plains of Philippi stretched wide and barren, ringed by marshes and hills. Autumn winds swept across the fields, rattling the soldiers' shields and carrying the smell of campfires into the cold Macedonian night. On one side stood the armies of the Triumvirs, Antony and Octavian, heirs of Caesar. On the other, the forces of Brutus and Cassius, the last defenders of the Republic. Rome's fate would be decided here, not in speeches or decrees, but in steel and blood. The forces were immense. Antony and Octavian commanded nearly 100,000 soldiers, veterans hardened by Caesar's campaigns, men bound by loyalty to the name of Caesar. Brutus and Cassius, no less formidable, fielded over 80,000 troops, including some of the best legions of the East. Both sides dug in, constructing fortified camps across the plain. For weeks, the armies glared at each other from behind palisades, too cautious to strike first. Skirmishes erupted in the marshes, probing attacks tested defenses, but the decisive clash lingered just out of reach. For Octavian, the weight was unbearable. His health once again faltered, and he spent much of the campaign bedridden in his tent. Antony, by contrast, thrived. He drilled the troops, built siege works, and maneuvered with energy. Even Brutus and Cassius admitted grudging respect for Antony's skill. Yet Octavian's name, Caesar, carried a weight Antony could never match. To the soldiers, he was not just a commander. He was the son of the man they had followed across Gaul, across the Rubicon, across the world. That name, more than Antony's charisma or Octavian's strategy, bound the legions together. The stalemate broke in October 42nd BCE. Brutus and Cassius, hoping to starve the Triumvirs into retreat, stretched their defenses across the plain. But Antony, bold and relentless, launched a direct assault on Cassius's camp. The fighting was ferocious. Antony's legions surged forward, storming the fortifications, cutting down defenders with ruthless efficiency. Cassius's camp fell in flames, his men cut down or scattered. Meanwhile, on the other side of the field, Brutus's forces struck Octavian's position. The young heir, still weak from illness, was absent from the battlefield, perhaps hiding in the marshes, as Antony later mocked. Brutus's men overran Octavian's camp, looting supplies and tearing down Caesar's standards. The day ended in chaos. Both sides claimed victory, Antony triumphant, Octavian humiliated, Brutus emboldened, Cassius shattered. But for Cassius, the loss was too great to bear. As dusk fell over the battlefield, Cassius climbed a hill overlooking the plain. Smoke still curled from his burning camp. He saw confusion, dust, and retreat, but not the whole picture. He believed Brutus had been defeated as well. Despair consumed him. Convinced the cause was lost, Cassius ordered his freedman Pindorus to strike him down. The man who had plotted Caesar's assassination, who had dreamed of saving the Republic, fell by his own command. It was a tragic irony. In truth, Brutus's men had been victorious against Octavian, but Cassius, misled by the fog of war, never knew. When Brutus learned of Cassius's death, he wept. One of the Republic's leaders was gone, not slain by an enemy, but undone by despair. Brutus still commanded a strong army, and he rallied his men with determination. For several weeks, both sides regrouped, rebuilding fortifications, tightening their lines. Brutus urged his soldiers to hold out, hoping Antony and Octavian's supply lines would collapse. But the triumvirs could not allow delay. Their men grew restless, hungry for decisive victory, impatient for the spoils of war. In late October, the Second Battle of Philippi erupted. This time Antony and Octavian coordinated their assault. The legions surged across the plain, slamming into Brutus's lines with relentless force. At first Brutus's men fought bravely, repelling the enemy with disciplined ranks. But Antony's experience and Octavian's sheer numbers began to overwhelm them. Slowly the lines buckled. Soldiers broke ranks, fleeing toward the hills. Brutus fought to the last, rallying his troops, refusing to yield. But when the rout became irreversible, he withdrew with a small band of followers. There, in the quiet shadows of the hills, Brutus made his final choice. Like Cassius before him, he chose death over capture. Drawing his sword, he fell upon it, declaring, "O wretched virtue, you were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real. But now you are only a slave to fortune." The last defender of the Republic was gone. The battlefield belonged to Antony and Octavian. The bodies of tens of thousands littered the plains. The cause of Brutus and Cassius, the dream of restoring the Republic, lay in ruins. For the soldiers of the triumvirs, it was a day of vengeance. Caesar's assassins had paid the price. Rome's destiny now belonged not to senators or conspirators, but to generals. For Octavian, the victory was monumental. Though Antony had commanded much of the fighting, Octavian emerged with the glory of Caesar's avenger. He could present himself not merely as heir, but as fulfiller of destiny. Yet beneath the triumph lay unease. Antony's star shone brighter on the battlefield. His soldiers adored him. His victories were tangible, his leadership undeniable. Octavian, still frail and cautious, risked being overshadowed. The alliance that had brought them together would not last forever. With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the Republic breathed its last. There would be no return to senatorial government, no restoration of liberty. The civil wars had swept away the old order. In its place stood the triumvirs, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. They now controlled the entire Roman world. But unity was fragile, and ambition unquenchable. As the legions marched back west, rumors swirled. How long could Antony and Octavian share power? How long before allies turned to enemies? The Republic was dead. What would replace it was still uncertain. Octavian returned to Rome with a new identity. He was no longer the sickly youth mocked by generals. He was the man who had avenged Caesar. Statues were raised in his honor, games held in his name. But he knew the truth. Antony was stronger, more charismatic, more beloved by the legions. If Octavian wished to rule Rome, he would need to be more than Caesar's heir. He would need to outwit, outmaneuver, and ultimately outlast Antony himself. The war with Brutus and Cassius was over. The war for Rome's soul had only just begun. The fields of Philippi still echoed with the clash of swords and the cries of the dying. But the war was over. Brutus and Cassius were dead, their armies scattered. their dream of a restored republic buried with them. In the aftermath, the victors, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, divided the spoils of empire. Antony took the wealthy East, Greece, Asia, and Egypt. Lepidus was given Africa, though his influence was already fading. Octavian claimed Italy and the West, along with the daunting responsibility of settling tens of thousands of Caesar's veterans. At just 21 years old, Octavian was master of Italy, but his position was precarious. Antony had wealth, charisma, and military prestige. Lepidus, though weaker, still held legions. Octavian's task was survival, and survival in Rome meant mastering both politics and perception. While Antony feasted in the East, Octavian faced crisis at home. Italy groaned under the burden of resettling Caesar's soldiers. Farms were seized, land redistributed, families forced from their homes to make way for veterans. Angry peasants rioted, senators grumbled, cities seethed with resentment. Octavian became the target of hatred. Mothers cursed him as they carried their children from confiscated homes. Farmers spat his name as they watched soldiers claim their fields. For all his promises of peace, Italy descended into unrest. But Octavian endured. He listened, he placated, he bribed when he had to and punished when he must. Slowly he weathered the storm, while across the sea Antony basked in luxury. Antony's time in the East brought him to Alexandria, where he met the woman who would shape his destiny. Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. She was intelligent, ambitious, and dazzlingly charismatic. She had once charmed Julius Caesar, and now she turned her attention to Antony. Their meeting was theatrical. Cleopatra sailing up the Nile in a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by music, perfume, and splendor. Antony was captivated. What began as political alliance became passionate romance. Antony lived openly with Cleopatra, fathered children with her, and embraced the luxuries of Egypt. To the Romans, it was scandalous. Antony, once the embodiment of Roman toughness, now seemed bewitched by an Eastern queen. Whispers spread that he had abandoned his Roman wife and Roman values for Egyptian excess. While Antony indulged in Alexandria, Octavian launched a relentless propaganda campaign. He painted Antony as a traitor to Rome, a man seduced by Cleopatra, corrupted by luxury, and plotting to hand Rome's provinces to foreign children. The most devastating blow came when Octavian obtained Antony's will, supposedly stolen from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins. He read it aloud in the Senate, shocking the city. In it, Antony requested to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome. To Romans, this was unforgivable. Burial in Rome was the highest honor, the sacred mark of belonging. Antony's choice branded him as a man who had turned his back on his people. Octavian's propaganda struck like a dagger. Antony was no longer seen as a rival general, but as a dangerous betrayer. Rome began to see Octavian as the defender of tradition, the guardian of Roman values. Meanwhile, Lepidus faded into irrelevance. Once a partner, he overplayed his hand, attempting to claim Sicily. Octavian moved swiftly, stripping him of power and sending him into comfortable exile. The Triumvirate was now a duumvirate, Antony in the east, Octavian in the west. But their alliance was broken beyond repair. Antony still commanded powerful legions and controlled vast wealth from Egypt. Octavian controlled Italy, the heart of Rome, and the loyalty of the Senate. Both men knew that a final reckoning was inevitable. The breaking point came in 32 BCE. Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant political maneuver. By framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen rather than a fellow Roman, he ensured the people rallied to him. But everyone knew the truth. The war was between Octavian and Antony, between West and East, between two men who could no longer share power. The preparations were immense. Antony and Cleopatra gathered a vast fleet, hundreds of warships lined with soldiers. Octavian, guided by his admiral Agrippa, built a disciplined navy and drilled his men tirelessly. The stage was set for the showdown that would decide the fate of Rome. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the two fleets clashed off the western coast of Greece, near Actium. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Ships rammed and splintered, soldiers fought hand-to-hand across decks slick with blood. For hours the struggle raged, neither side gaining the upper hand. Then, in a stunning turn, Cleopatra's ship suddenly broke from the line and fled toward Egypt. Antony, torn between duty and desire, abandoned the fight to follow her. His men watched in disbelief as their general sailed away. Without leadership, Antony's fleet collapsed. Agrippa pressed the attack, and Octavian's navy secured a decisive victory. The war was effectively over. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra, cornered in Alexandria, chose death over capture. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, according to legend, ended her life with the bite of an asp. With their deaths, Octavian stood alone. No rivals remained, no generals threatened his power. For the first time in history, Rome had a single master. When Octavian returned to Rome, he returned not as a conqueror drenched in arrogance, but as a savior. He presented himself as the man who had defended Rome from foreign corruption, who had rid the world of Cleopatra's influence and restored Roman honor. In truth, he had done far more. He had ended a century of civil wars. He had destroyed his rivals. He had cleared the stage for something entirely new. Rome would no longer be a republic. It would be an empire, and its first emperor was ready to take his throne. The dust of Actium had barely settled when Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. His rivals were dead, their armies scattered, their legacies destroyed. For the first time in 100 years, there was no rival general, no competing statesman, no alternative vision of power. Rome belonged to Octavian, but Octavian knew the dangers of appearing too powerful. He had seen what happened to his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, when he accepted titles that smacked of monarchy. Rome still hated kings. The very word rex was poison. If Octavian seemed too ambitious, too obvious, daggers might once again flash in the Senate. He had won the war. Now he had to win the peace. Octavian began a performance of humility so masterful it reshaped history. In January of 27 BCE, he stood before the Senate and announced that he was surrendering his extraordinary powers. The provinces he had governed, the armies he had commanded, he returned them all to the Senate and people of Rome. The senators were stunned. After decades of civil war, here was the most powerful man in Rome, voluntarily giving up his authority. They begged him to reconsider, pleading that he remain in office to safeguard Rome. It was exactly the reaction Octavian wanted. He accepted their pleas, reluctantly, as if burdened by duty. In truth, the entire scene had been orchestrated. By pretending to step down, he gained legitimacy to hold power indefinitely. The Senate rewarded him with a new title, Augustus, the revered one. From that moment on, Octavian was gone. Rome's first emperor had been born. Augustus understood that raw power was not enough. He had to cloak it in tradition, to make monarchy palatable to a people who had once prided themselves on liberty. He presented himself not as a king but as the princeps, the first citizen. The Senate still met, magistrates still held office, laws still passed through the proper channels. But these were shadows. Behind them, Augustus controlled everything. He held supreme command of the army. He governed the key provinces where the legions were stationed. He controlled Rome's finances. He wielded tribunician power, giving him authority to veto and protect the people, and consular power, allowing him to guide the Senate. It was monarchy in all but name, but because it was wrapped in the familiar language of the Republic, Romans embraced it. Augustus immediately set about reshaping Rome's institutions. The army, once loyal to ambitious generals, was restructured into a professional force loyal to the state, and thus to him. Veterans were settled in colonies, but Augustus ensured they received land and pay through the state treasury rather than personal largesse, reducing the temptation for generals to raise private armies. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed in Italy to protect him personally. No Roman leader had ever stationed soldiers so close to the capital. It was a subtle but unmistakable sign. Augustus was not just another magistrate. He was the source of security itself. He also reformed the provinces. Strategic regions rich in resources or military value, like Egypt, were placed directly under his control. Senators could govern peaceful provinces, but the lifeblood of Rome's wealth and armies remained firmly in Augustus's hands. Augustus knew that power was not only felt in politics but seen in stone. He launched an ambitious program of building and renovation. Temples were restored, aqueducts repaired, forums expanded. New monuments rose to celebrate Rome's greatness and his leadership. The most famous of these was the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace. Its marble reliefs depicted processions of senators, priests, and Augustus's own family, linking his reign to piety, prosperity, and divine favor. Augustus boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The transformation was not merely cosmetic. It was propaganda carved in stone, a daily reminder to every Roman citizen that peace and prosperity flowed from Augustus. Augustus mastered the art of image-making. Statues of him were erected across the empire, always showing him youthful and serene, untouched by age. On coins, his face appeared beside symbols of victory, prosperity, and divine blessing. He avoided the arrogance that had doomed Caesar. Where Caesar had flaunted his power, Augustus presented himself as humble, almost reluctant, a servant of Rome rather than its master. Yet his humility was carefully staged. When he walked through the streets, citizens saw not a king, but a man chosen by the gods to restore order. Augustus also sought to reshape Roman society itself. He believed the chaos of the Republic had been caused not just by political failures, but by moral decay. He passed laws encouraging marriage and childbirth, punishing adultery, and promoting family life. He revived ancient religious festivals and rituals, presenting himself as the guardian of Roman values. Temples long neglected were rededicated, and the old gods seemed to breathe again under his patronage. But even in his own family, these ideals faltered. His daughter Julia became notorious for her affairs, defying the very laws her father had written. Eventually, Augustus exiled her, a painful reminder that even emperors could not control every aspect of life. The Senate, stripped of true power, was given honors and wealth to keep it compliant. Senators enjoyed prestige, processions, and a role in ceremonies, but real decisions were made by Augustus and his advisors. It was a masterstroke of politics. The elite were flattered with the illusion of authority while Augustus quietly pulled every string. By the end of his reforms, the transformation was complete. Rome was no longer a republic. It was an empire ruled by one man. Yet Augustus had done what no dictator before him had achieved. He made Romans accept it. Civil war was over. The Republic was dead. In its place stood the Principate, a system that combined monarchy with the facade of republican tradition. And at its center stood Augustus, calm, patient, ruthless, and eternal in marble. Rome had not crowned a king, but it had crowned something greater, the beginning of empire. When Augustus assumed control of Rome, he inherited a city scarred by a century of civil wars. Families had been torn apart, farmland seized, and veterans left restless and bitter. Blood had flowed too often in the Forum. Many feared that Rome could never recover. And yet, under Augustus, Rome experienced something extraordinary. For the first time in memory, the Mediterranean world was at peace. No rival armies marched on the capital. No assassins plotted in the shadows of the Senate. No generals raised private legions to seize power. Historians call this era the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It began with Augustus and would last for 2 centuries. Augustus understood that peace at home required security abroad. He stationed legions along the empire's frontiers, transforming them into permanent garrisons rather than roving armies loyal to ambitious generals. On the Rhine and the Danube, soldiers built fortresses, roads, and watchtowers, holding back Germanic tribes. In the east, Augustus negotiated with Parthia, Rome's great rival, securing the return of captured legionary standards lost years earlier by Crassus. The symbolic victory restored Roman honor without the cost of another disastrous war. Egypt, newly conquered, was placed under Augustus's direct control. Its vast grain supplies flowed steadily into Rome, ensuring the city's hungry population was fed. Rome's borders became firm, its armies disciplined, its provinces stable. For ordinary people across the empire, this meant safety, a life free from the constant fear of invasion and war. Augustus knew that power had to be visible. He poured wealth into rebuilding and beautifying Rome. Temples, aqueducts, theaters, and forums rose in gleaming marble. Streets once choked with chaos were paved and ordered. Monuments proclaimed victory, stability, and divine favor. The Forum of Augustus stood as a testament to Rome's destiny, its walls adorned with statues of Rome's great men, reminding citizens of their heritage and their future. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, depicted processions of priests, senators, and Augustus's own family, presenting him as both the guardian of Rome and the chosen of the gods. Visitors from across the empire marveled at the grandeur. Rome was no longer just a city. It was the beating heart of civilization. Augustus also understood the needs of the common people. Grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa ensured no Roman went hungry. Public games and festivals entertained the masses, filling amphitheaters with chariot races, gladiatorial combat, and theatrical performances. The people had once rioted against shortages, dragged politicians through the streets, and demanded land and wealth from their rulers. Under Augustus, they were fed, entertained, and pacified. The poet Juvenal would later describe this policy as panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Augustus had mastered the art of keeping the people loyal not through fear alone, but through satisfaction. No less important than soldiers and monuments was culture. Augustus fostered a flourishing of art and literature that shaped Roman identity for centuries. Virgil composed the Aeneid Syndobe, Rome's national epic. In it, the Trojan hero Aeneas wandered from the ruins of Troy to the shores of Italy, guided by the gods to found a new race, the Romans. The poem did more than tell a story. It proclaimed that Augustus was the fulfillment of destiny, the heir of Aeneas, chosen to lead Rome into greatness. Horace wrote odes celebrating discipline, moderation, and loyalty to the state, the very values Augustus sought to restore. Livy penned a monumental history of Rome, glorifying its legendary past while providing moral lessons for its future. Ovid, though more playful and rebellious, produced the Metamorphoses, a sweeping epic of mythology that remains one of the greatest works of Latin literature. Through poetry and prose, Augustus controlled not only the politics of Rome, but its imagination. He ensured that future generations would see his reign as the dawn of a golden age. Augustus believed the collapse of the Republic had been caused not only by political corruption, but by moral decay. He presented himself as a reformer, a man determined to revive the old virtues of Rome. He rebuilt temples, revived ancient priesthoods, and emphasized the worship of traditional gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Vesta. Religion became a tool of unity, binding Romans together through shared rituals and festivals. He also passed laws encouraging marriage and punishing adultery, seeking to strengthen family life. To Augustus, discipline and morality were the foundation of stability. But enforcing morality was not easy, even within his own household. His daughter Julia openly defied him, indulging in scandalous affairs that mocked his laws. At last, Augustus was forced to exile her, a painful reminder that even emperors could not control their families. The genius of Augustus lay in balance. He concentrated all real power in his own hands, yet maintained the illusion of republican tradition. The Senate was reduced to a ceremonial body, stripped of true authority, but showered with honors and wealth. Magistrates were elected, but their powers were limited. The people voted, but the outcomes were predetermined. Most Romans did not care. After decades of chaos, they preferred stability to liberty. Augustus gave them peace, prosperity, and pride. In return, they surrendered their freedom. It was a bargain Augustus understood perfectly. He once said that he ruled with auctoritas, influence, respect, and prestige, rather than raw force. In reality, he ruled with both. For all his success, Augustus faced one problem he could never fully solve: succession. Who would rule after him? He had no surviving sons. He adopted heirs, first Marcellus, then Agrippa, then his grandsons Gaius and Lucius. One by one they died young, leaving Augustus to search for another successor. At last, he turned to bind Tiberius, his reluctant stepson. Stern, capable but unloved, Tiberius was hardly the ideal heir. Yet Augustus had no choice. He carefully prepared him for power, ensuring the empire would not collapse when he was gone. The uncertainty of succession revealed the weakness of Augustus's system. The principate depended not on institutions but on the character of one man. What would happen when that man was no longer there? As his reign stretched on, Augustus's image became almost divine. Statues showed him forever young, untouched by age. In the provinces, temples were erected in his honor. Coins bore not just his face but symbols of the gods, blurring the line between mortal ruler and divine protector. In Rome itself, Augustus was careful to avoid the title of God during his life. But across the empire, people prayed to him, honored him, and saw him as the guarantor of peace and prosperity. It was more than propaganda. For millions of people, Augustus was not just a ruler, he was Rome itself. For 40 years, Augustus ruled as the architect of a new world. Roads stretched across continents, cities flourished, trade flowed, and culture thrived. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, safe for merchants, soldiers, and travelers. But the price was liberty. The Senate no longer debated with real power. Elections were rituals, not choices. Rome's proud tradition of shared government was gone, replaced by the will of one man. To many, it was a fair exchange. Better peace under an emperor than chaos under a republic. But the question lingered. Had Rome lost something essential in its pursuit of stability? Augustus had given his people greatness, but also dependence. They could no longer imagine Rome without him. By the end of his reign, Augustus had reshaped not only Rome, but the world. His legacy was carved into stone, etched into poetry, and stamped onto the very identity of Rome. For the citizens of his empire, life was richer, safer, and more stable than it had ever been. For the Senate, dignity was preserved in ceremony, even as real power slipped away. For Augustus himself, the dream of Caesar had been fulfilled. Rome was united, supreme, eternal. The Pax Romana was his gift, but it was also his greatest trap. For how could any successor live up to the man who had become a legend in his own lifetime? After more than 4 decades of rule, Augustus had become an institution. For a generation of Romans, there had never been a time without him. He was the man who had ended civil wars, brought prosperity, and reshaped Rome into an empire. He seemed eternal, his youthful statues suggesting a ruler untouched by age. But time comes even for emperors. In his later years, Augustus grew reflective. He had built marble monuments, restored temples, and left his stamp on every aspect of Roman life. Yet behind the public image he worried. Would the peace he had created survive him? Would the principate endure? His succession plans had been plagued by tragedy. One by one, his chosen heirs, Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, and Lucius, had died young. At last he settled on his stepson, Tiberius. A capable general but a man of dour temperament, with none of Augustus's charm. Rome grumbled. Tiberius was respected, but unloved. Still, Augustus had no choice. He carefully prepared him, granting him honors, sharing tribunician power, ensuring a smooth transition. The empire could not afford chaos after his death. In private, Augustus grew frail. His health declined and he withdrew more often to the countryside. Yet in public, he remained the image of strength, for even at the end he understood that power was theater. In the summer of 14th CE, at the age of 75, Augustus fell gravely ill while traveling near Nola. Gathered around him were his family and attendants. Sensing the end, Augustus turned to those closest to him and asked a final, almost theatrical question. Did I play my part well in the comedy of life? It was the voice of an actor leaving the stage, a man who understood that rulership itself was a performance. Then, with calm dignity, he whispered, "Applaud, for the play is over." Rome's first emperor was dead. News of Augustus's death spread quickly through the empire. In Rome, grief mingled with awe. The man who had given them peace, who had ruled for longer than most could remember, was gone. His body was carried in a grand procession through the city. Senators, priests, soldiers, and citizens marched together. Eulogies were delivered in the Forum, recounting his victories, his reforms, his gifts to the people. Then his coffin was borne to the mausoleum of Augustus, the massive tomb he had built on the banks of the Tiber. It was not just a resting place. It was a monument to his eternal place in Rome's history. But Augustus's story did not end with his death. The Senate declared him a god. Altars were raised, priests appointed, temples dedicated to his worship. Across the provinces, his image was honored alongside the gods of Olympus. Rome had not merely lost a man. It had gained a deity. The boy once dismissed as frail and irrelevant was now enshrined in the heavens, worshipped as Divus Augustus. Oh, this was more than piety. It was politics. Deifying Augustus legitimized the rule of his successor, Tiberius, linking the living emperor to the divine founder. It established a tradition that would shape Rome for centuries, binding emperors to the gods and elevating them beyond the reach of mere mortals. What then was Augustus's legacy? He had ended the Republic, but he had given Rome stability. He had concentrated power in one man, but he had disguised it beneath the forms of tradition. He had created the Principate, a system that balanced monarchy with the illusion of republican freedom, and it endured for centuries. Under Augustus, Rome entered its golden age. The Pax Romana secured trade, wealth, and safety across the Mediterranean. Literature flourished, monuments rose, and a shared Roman identity bound diverse peoples together. Yet there was a cost. Liberty withered. The Senate became a shadow, the people spectators. Rome had exchanged freedom for security, self-rule for empire. To some, Augustus was a savior, the man who rescued Rome from chaos. To others, he was a tyrant, the destroyer of the Republic. Both were true. Augustus's reign embodies one of history's greatest paradoxes. Can peace and freedom coexist? He proved that stability often demands sacrifice, that people will surrender liberty if it means safety and prosperity. Rome thrived under his system, but it thrived as an empire, not a republic. His successors would inherit both the glory and the burden of his creation. Some would rule wisely, others cruelly, but none could escape the shadow of Augustus. He had set the stage. Every emperor after him would be measured against his reign. More than 2,000 years later, the name Augustus still resonates. Cities, months, monuments, and empires echo his legacy. He was the man who transformed Rome from a republic torn apart by ambition into an empire that shaped the Western world. He played his part with brilliance, ruthlessness, and vision. He understood that power was not seized in a moment, but built carefully, patiently, with cunning as sharp as any sword. When we look back at Rome, we see many names: Caesar, Antony, Brutus, Nero. But above them all, one stands eternal: Augustus. The boy who became a god. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Augustus was a savior who gave Rome peace, or a tyrant who destroyed its liberty? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Roman Archives, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next story from the empire that shaped history.